Hey students, so today the goal of this presentation is for you to learn some basic background knowledge about water filtration and the different filter media that we saw in our experiment on Tuesday, so that when you start your engineering challenge, when you build your water filters, you have a little bit more background knowledge about what each filter media does. So let's get started. Let's start with the basic question. We have been studying this. Why is water an issue for us in the 21st century? So water, as you guys know, is essential to all life on Earth. Our bodies are roughly 70 to 75% water, and we can't go more than a few days without water. This map right here shows us um, what percent of people that live in these areas have access to potable or drinking water. And you can see that not everyone in the world has access to drinking water. The dark red represents 22 to 51% of people have access to potable water, but that's less than half of the population. And most of these countries are in Africa. There is a very big disparity or gap between people who have access to water and people who do not, and nearly 1 in 8 people around the world do not have access to clean water. Based on current trends over the next 20 years, humans will need 40% more water than they do now, according to the United Nations Environmental Program. So it's very important that we take care of our water and we conserve it as well as learn how to purify it because, as you know, there's a lot of contamination. So some of the reasons why our water is getting contaminated is because of various sources from land. So we have here trash from littering, chemicals from factories, or even landfills can seep into the soil, which can go into our groundwater, as you can see in this diagram here. Pesticides and fertilizers from farming are a big one, especially in the United States. Motor oil from roads can go into the rain gutters when it rains. Air pollution, when it rains, all of that, the pollution in the air will rain back down on us. Some animal waste, plastic pollution, and even sometimes in our natural ecosystems, we have bacteria and viruses in the water, and that could also make us very sick. So, water filters are basically devices that are used to remove these contaminants from the water source. Usually, they're a mix of layered materials that remove different contaminants. And this over here is a picture of one of the early models of a water filter. And this here is a picture of one of the water filters that we use today, the Brita filter. So there are two types of filtration. There's physical filtration and chemical filtration. Let's start with physical filtration. So physical filtration is when you use an actual physical barrier and straining to remove the contaminants. So a good analogy for this is a colander. So this is a picture of a colander right here. And basically the colander will trap the you know the materials inside and let the water come out. So physical filtration is when there's an actual sieve or a barrier that will trap the contaminants like this. Chemical filtration is a little bit different. Chemical filtration uses chemical reactions or interactions between atoms to remove contamination. So this is more at the smaller scale level. So here in this picture, you can see an example of chemical filtration. So you can see there are some holes in this media here, and in here there's smaller molecules with prongs, and as this contaminated water goes through this uh, this media, you can see this is the pollution. The pollution gets trapped in between these molecules because there's an interaction between this atom and this molecule, and it gets attracted and it binds. So you can see uh, the difference between these two types of filtration. And we will see and we will study both of these types of filtrations in more detail as we build our water filters. So these are the 8 basic materials that we are going to be using for our project. We have activated carbon, which is, this is a picture of it. We have pasta, cotton balls, coffee filters, plastic sponge, which you can't see here, but they're basically, sponges. You guys have probably all seen them. Sand, gravel, and zeolite, which is a type of rock, which is not pictured here, but I'll be talking about it more later. So let's talk about activated carbon first. So activated carbon, here's a zoomed up picture. It's actually a form of charcoal, but what's different about it is that it has many more pores inside, and these pores are little holes in the carbon. They were produced from burning the charcoal or the wood in a lower oxygen environment. And so the advantages of activated carbon is that they are very porous, so that means it has a lot of holes, and these pores help trap contaminants through chemical filtration. Activated carbon can remove things like food coloring molecules, chlorine, and even pesticides. The disadvantages are that they don't necessarily remove metal atoms, so heavy metals, you can't really remove them very easily with activated carbon. And also, another disadvantage is that over time, as you use activated carbon over and over, the pores can get clogged, meaning that you will have to wash them out or get new activated carbon in order for it to work effectively again. Now let's talk about pasta. So again, pasta, you guys have probably all eaten pasta, but if we look at it from a molecular level, it's made out of a molecule called starch, which is a long chain molecule that was made in plants. And here's a picture of starch. And in case you forgot, last year we did a bioplastic project where we used different kinds of starch, and we did study amylose and amylopectin, and we used this to make plastics. Um, and one of the advantages of starch, starch-based products, the pasta, is that it can remove things like salts, food colorings, and vinegars through chemical filtration. Sometimes, if there's oil in the water, the oils can also stick to its surface. Some disadvantages are that it can't remove all of the salts, vinegar, food coloring. It depends on how much of the water touches the surface of the pasta and how long the water is within the pasta. If it just runs through, it might not filter out everything. Um, Also, when the pasta is dry, it could be very slow at absorbing materials. So sometimes, when you pour water on top of this, the water runs through so quickly that it doesn't necessarily absorb all the contaminants in a quick rate. The other thing is that pasta tends to absorb water along with the salt and the vinegar and food coloring, so some of the water gets lost as some of that is absorbed. And another disadvantage is that we can't reuse pasta. Every time we build the filter, we will have to throw it out and replace it, which could technically be very wasteful. So, something to keep in mind when you build your filters. Okay, so now let's talk about paper and cotton, paper-based materials. So coffee filters, cotton balls, and other paper-based materials have cellulose fibers. And this is a picture, zoomed up picture of a, cellulose fiber. And you can see it's a network of fibers. And cellulose is a type of sugar that's made in plants, and it helps give plants their structure. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these products. So the advantages are that these filters have smaller pores that could be effective at trapping bacteria and larger molecules like food coloring and oils. You may have noticed that things like band-aids have like a paper or cotton base pad, and that's because they are very effective at trapping larger bacteria. The disadvantages are that we can't really reuse these filters. Once we use them up, once they have absorbed things like color and oil, it's very difficult to rinse out that oil or coloring to reuse, so we'll have to replace them frequently. The pores are fairly large, so smaller ions, metal atoms, and viruses can still slip through the pores. Um, just like pasta, these paper-based materials will also absorb some water along with the materials, so some water is lost. And the other thing is, once the material has been saturated, that means that it's all used up. It can no longer absorb anything else. So, for example, once the coffee filter is all wet with water, it will no longer absorb anymore. So, at that point, you would have to replace it or get a new filter. Okay, now let's talk about sand and gravel as a medium. So, recall from last year, we learned about the rock cycle. And sand and gravel are a part of the rock cycle. As I put an arrow here, it's pointing to weathering and erosion because if you recall, one part of the rock cycle is that there are processes like wind and water um, that will break rocks down into smaller pieces, and that's weathering. And sometimes when those rocks move to new locations, that's erosion. So sand and gravel are both produced by this rock cycle, the weathering and erosion. So the advantages of using things like sand and gravel is that first of all, they are natural resources. So when we see filtration in nature, it's usually some layer, some kind of form of sand and gravel and fine rock being layered, and they can filter out larger particles and contaminants from the water through physical filtration. Some disadvantages, though, is that they will not filter out chemicals or metals from the water because it is physical filtration. That means it acts kind of like the colander or that bowl that you can use to rinse out your pasta, but it won't remove the contaminants chemically, which are what chemical pollutants do and smaller metals do. So you might need to pair these with another kind of media like activated carbon in order for your filter to be very effective. Lastly, let's talk about zeolite. So zeolite, here's a picture of zeolite. So it's actually a natural form of rock. It's usually found around volcanic rocks. And so in this picture, this white part, this is a zeolite. This is more of a volcanic rock here. But what is unique about this is that they have pores just like not aluminum, activated carbon, and they are very, very useful for filtration. You can usually find zeolite in aquarium stores because it's often used to filter out aquarium water as well. So zeolite is usually made out of elements like aluminum and silicon. And so let's take a look at zeolite at a closer scale. So here's a structure of zeolite. And one of the main advantages is that the structure of zeolite, you can see they have pores like this, and it's charged. So that means that it can remove charged metal particles like lead, copper, ammonia, zinc, nickel, and iron, which activated carbon cannot filter out those things. So this is very, very useful in trapping those heavy metals that might be harmful for our bodies. Um, and I will go over more of the details of how zeolite can trap these particles in these holes in a later presentation, but just know that because this is a charged molecule, that means there's a positive and negative charges attracting each other. This is a type of chemical filtration. And one disadvantage is that there's actually different types of zeolites with different pore sizes, and depending on the type of zeolite you have, it can filter out some metals, but not all, because metals are also different sizes as well. So that is one disadvantage. Another disadvantage is because it is a charged particle, it can filter out only positively charged metal ions. So that's another disadvantage. If it's not positively charged, it's not likely to be filtered out. And that's it.